Picture this. You're hiking through a forest in western Germany. The trees are tall, dense, dark evergreens packed so tightly together that the sunlight barely makes it down to the ground. There's a kind of heavy quiet here, the kind you don't usually find in forests. No birdsong carrying through the branches, no rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth, just silence and the occasional distant creak of an old tree shifting in the wind. The path you're walking is narrow, signposted, carefully marked, and you know better than to step off it, because nailed to trees along the edge of the trail, half hidden beneath moss and dead ivy, are warning signs. Old ones, new ones, all saying the same thing. Do not leave the marked path. Danger, explosives. These aren't precautionary signs. They aren't there because of a loose trail edge or a steep drop. They're there because somewhere beneath your feet, buried under 8 decades of fallen leaves and pine needles and shifting German soil, are the weapons of a war that officially ended in 1945. Mines, artillery shells, hand grenades, bombs, still loaded, still armed, still capable of killing you. This is the Hürtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile stretch of dark woodland straddling the border between Germany and Belgium, roughly triangulated between the cities of Aachen, Düren, and Monschau. To look at it today, it seems peaceful, almost beautiful in a heavy, quiet sort of way. Trees rising to 100 feet, deep valleys carved by rivers, high plateaus draped in green. But step off the designated paths, and you're playing a game of chance with the past. A past that is, in many places, still armed and waiting. Today we're going into that forest, into the history, the horror, and the haunting reality of what still lurks there. Because the story of the Hürtgen Forest is not just a World War II story, it's happening right now, and it may not fully resolve in any of our lifetimes. What is the Hürtgen Forest? Before we can understand what happened here, you need to understand the place itself. The Hürtgen Forest, Hürtgenwald in German, covers approximately 140 square kilometers of the Eifel uplands in North Rhine-Westphalia. It sits right along the Belgian-German border, and its terrain is nothing short of extreme. This isn't a gentle, strolling woodland with open meadows and wide paths. It's a landscape of plunging valleys and steep ridges, rocky gorges and deep ravines cut by rivers like the Kahl and the Ruhr. The tree cover is almost entirely dense evergreen conifer, tall, tightly packed fir trees that grow so close together that their canopy becomes nearly solid. In places, the interior of the forest in full summer is as dark as late dusk. Before the Second World War, the Hürtgen was used almost entirely for timber production. Small villages sat on its edges, places like Wassenack, Schmidt, Kommerscheid, Hürtgen itself, farmers, foresters, people living quiet lives in a quiet corner of Germany that nobody in the wider world paid much attention to. German soldiers in World War II had their own name for this place. They called it the Grüne Hölle, the Green Hell. And they knew, even before the Americans arrived, exactly why it deserved that name. They had been preparing this forest for battle since before the fighting reached the German border. Concrete bunkers constructed as part of the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, sat embedded among the trees, camouflaged so perfectly beneath years of fallen leaves and pine needles that they were nearly invisible until you were almost standing on top of them. Minefields were laid along every trail. Barbed wire was strung at ankle height between the trees. Every natural clearing had been pre-sighted for artillery fire. Every valley became a channeling funnel for anyone trying to advance. By the time American soldiers first entered this forest in September 1944, the Germans knew every inch of it. They, Americans, walking in for the first time, knew almost nothing. Why did the Americans enter? To understand why any general would choose to fight in a place like this, you have to understand the strategic picture of late 1944. By September of that year, Allied forces had exploded out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were racing across France and Belgium. The mood in Allied headquarters was almost euphoric. Many believed Germany was on the verge of collapse, that the war in Europe could be over by Christmas. But Germany's western defenses, the Siegfried Line, a deep belt of fortifications, pillboxes, tank traps, and reinforced bunkers stretching hundreds of miles along Germany's border, had not yet been cracked. And just inside that border, the Hürtgen Forest sat like a dark knot of resistance. The man charged with pushing through this area was General Courtney Hodges, commander of the United States First Army. His initial objective was straightforward on paper: push through the forest, cross the Ruhr River, and advance toward the Rhine. From there, the road to Germany's industrial heartland lay open. What the American High Command initially failed to appreciate, however, was a pair of enormous dams, the Schwammenau and Urftelsperre, sitting at the head of the Ruhr River Valley, just inside the forest's eastern edge. These dams controlled an enormous reservoir of water. If the Germans opened those floodgates, the entire Ruhr River Valley downstream would be inundated. Any American force that crossed the river while the Germans held the dams could find itself cut off, isolated, surrounded by floods. The Americans couldn't safely cross until they controlled those dams, and the only direct route to those dams ran directly through the Hürtgen. There was another option. Historians have argued ever since that American commanders could have simply gone around the forest, bypassed it to the south, seized the dams from a more favorable direction, and left the Hürtgen to be mopped up later. But that option was rejected. General Hodges chose to push straight through, to fight the forest on the forest's terms. It was, historians would later conclude almost unanimously, one of the worst tactical decisions in the history of the United States Army. The Germans, commanded by the brilliant defensive tactician Field Marshal Walter Model, understood exactly what the Americans had walked into. Model was perfectly willing to fight a battle of attrition here. Every American soldier chewed up in the Hürtgen was one less threat to the coming Ardennes offensive he was secretly preparing. The operation that would become the Battle of the Bulge. The longer the Americans hammered away at the forest, the more time Model had to prepare his masterstroke. He bled them white, deliberately, methodically, and the Americans kept coming. The Green Hell. The battle. The battle began officially on September 19, 1944, and it would not fully end until February 10th, 1945, nearly 5 months. The longest battle ever fought by the United States Army, and it remains to this day one of the most miserable military experiences in American military history. To understand what soldiers endured in the Hürtgen, you have to understand what that forest meant for modern warfare. The dense canopy stripped the Americans of their greatest advantages, their overwhelming air power, and their superiority in armor. Bombers couldn't hit what they couldn't see beneath the trees. Tanks couldn't maneuver off the few narrow, muddy forest roads without immediately becoming stuck or disabled. Artillery became almost as dangerous to the men firing it as to the enemy, because shells detonating in the treetops sent storms of steel and timber fragments raining down on anyone below. These were called tree bursts, and they became the defining horror of the Hürtgen. A German shell would arc into the forest canopy and detonate against a treetop 80 or 100 feet off the ground. The explosion sent cascading shrapnel and splintered wood screaming downward in a cone-shaped storm. A foxhole, normally adequate cover against ground-burst artillery, offered almost no protection. The fragments came from above. Soldiers dug covered fighting positions roofed with logs and sod, trying to build themselves overhead protection, but there was never enough time and never enough dry wood to do it properly. You could hear a shell coming and hit the ground, and it wouldn't matter. The burst was already above you. Technical Sergeant George Morgan, an armorer with the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, described it this way: The forest up there was a hell of an eerie place to fight. You can't get protection. You can't see. You can't get fields of fire. Artillery slashes the trees like a scythe. Everything is tangled. You can scarcely walk. Everybody is cold and wet, and the mixture of cold rain and sleet keeps falling. And the mines. The Germans had planted their minefields with an almost diabolical thoroughness. A 3-mile wide zone was booby-trapped with mines placed every 8 paces to slow any advance. But it wasn't just standard anti-tank mines and anti-personnel mines. The Germans had also deployed wooden box mines and glass mines, devices that contained almost no metal components and were therefore completely invisible to the metal detectors the Americans used to sweep the ground ahead. You could clear a path perfectly, mark it with white engineering tape, and still have men detonating buried wooden-cased pressure mines with the next footstep. The tape would blow away in the wind anyway, or disappear under fresh mud and snow, and soldiers would find themselves back in an unmarked field, not knowing which ground was safe. The weather made everything worse. The autumn of 1944 was relentlessly wet. Rain fell almost every day. The forest floor turned to deep mud. Cold, sucking mud that pulled at boots and swallowed vehicles. Narrow supply trails became impassable. The famous Cowell Trail, a steep path down into the Cowell River Valley that the Americans attempted to use as their main supply route, became such a disaster that tanks and half-tracks were simply abandoned where they bogged down. Some of that equipment remained on the slopes for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. As autumn deepened into winter, the rain became sleet and then snow. Men who had been soaked to the skin for weeks began suffering frostbite and trenchfoot in alarming numbers. The 84th Division alone suffered 500 casualties from trenchfoot, not from bullets or shells, but from cold and wet and neglect. Units rotated in fresh and came out broken. Replacements arrived and became casualties before they even knew the name of their regiment. One Army Lieutenant, Leonard Lomels, who had survived the famous Pointe du Hoc assault on D-Day, put it this way: one way or another, they got you. You froze to death, or you got sick, or you got blown to bits. Ernest Hemingway, covering the battle as a war correspondent, described it in one devastating phrase: Passchendaele with tree bursts. He was drawing a comparison to the most notorious slaughter of World War I, a battle remembered for mud and futility and casualties that seemed to have no proportionate result. He wasn't wrong. 17 divisions of the United States Army were fed into the Hürtgen Forest over the course of the campaign, 11 infantry divisions, and multiple armored and ranger units. Between them, they suffered at least 33,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured, with some estimates reaching as high as 55,000, when non-combat losses from illness, frostbite, and combat exhaustion are included. Some units suffered casualty rates that exceeded 100% of their original strength. As replacements arrived, became casualties, and were replaced again. The 22nd Infantry Regiment, veterans of D-Day who entered the Hürtgen in November 1944, considered one of the finest regiments in the Army, suffered 2,806 casualties over 18 days of fighting. They advanced approximately 6,000 yards. One soldier fell for every 2 yards gained. Their casualty rate reached 86% of their full strength. After 3 days in the forest, the regiment had lost all 3 of its battalion commanders. And when the battle finally, mercifully ended, officially terminated not by victory, but because the German Ardennes offensive began on December 16th and pulled attention elsewhere, the Americans had little to show for the sacrifice. A few miles of shell holes, shattered villages, tree stumps where forests had stood. As historian Charles MacDonald, who actually fought in the Hürtgen as a company commander, later wrote, "The battle was a misconceived and basically fruitless battle." The Germans, for their part, had done exactly what they intended. They had bought time for the Battle of the Haas Bulge, and they had done it by turning a forest into a death machine. A battlefield, frozen in time. When the last shots faded and the surviving soldiers moved on, what remained in the Hürtgen Forest was almost incomprehensible. The villages had been obliterated. Wassenach, Schmidt, Kammerscheid, places that had been home to farming families for generations, were rubble. When the evacuated civilians began returning in February 1945, they found moonscapes, mud and wreckage, and the remains of men who hadn't been recovered. Dead soldiers from both sides still lay in the forest. Weapons and equipment lay where they had been dropped or abandoned. Rifles, helmets, half-tracks, tanks, artillery pieces. The Kahl Trail was littered with American vehicles that had bogged down and been left behind, their crews having walked out or been carried out on stretchers. And then there were the explosives. Millions of shells had been fired into this 50-square-mile forest. Thousands of mines had been laid. Grenades had been thrown. Shells had been loaded into breaches and fired. Bombs had been dropped from aircraft. Not all of them had detonated. Far from it. The unexploded ordnance that remained in the soil of the Hürtgen after the battle was staggering in volume, and the vast majority of it was invisible, sunk into the mud, swallowed by the soft forest floor, covered over by falling leaves and rain. In the summers of 1947 and 1948, something new and terrifying happened. The forest caught fire during dry spells. The heat was enough to detonate phosphorus shells and ammunition that had been lying in the undergrowth for 2 years. The fires became almost impossible to fight. The sky over the northern Eifel Mountains glowed red at night as trees and undergrowth burned uncontrollably, accompanied by the constant crack and boom of exploding ordnance. Firefighters couldn't approach because the ground beneath their feet was itself a weapon. German army prisoners of war were assigned to work as bomb disposal teams, essentially forced to walk into the most dangerous areas and try to clear the mines and shells. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. By the time a reasonable amount of clearance had been done, more than 100 post-war workers had been killed. The German war cemetery at Hürtgen was opened in 1952, and among those buried there are approximately 100 victims of mines and unexploded ordnance who died after the battle had ended. Not soldiers, not combatants. People who came after trying to make the land safe. The forest killed them too. The iron harvest. What remains here is a figure that should stop you for a moment. Every single year, Germany unearths approximately 2,000 tons of unexploded World War II ordnance. 2,000 tons, annually. That's not a historical footnote. That's the size of a small freighter's cargo in explosive material, being recovered from German soil every 12 months, nearly 80 years after the war. In Hoyd, Berlin alone, 1.8 million pieces of ordnance were diffused between 1947 and 2018. 1.8 million in a single city. The scale of what was dropped on Europe during World War II is almost impossible to process. American and British air forces dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on Europe during the war. By one reasonable estimate, somewhere between 10 and 30% of those bombs never detonated. Many sank into soft earth before their fuses could trigger. Others landed at angles that disabled their fuses. Some simply malfunctioned. And every single one of those duds is still out there somewhere. Under fields, under construction sites, under rivers, under school playgrounds, under motorways. Before any construction project begins in Germany, whether it's a new house, an extension, a railway, a stadium, the ground must first be surveyed and certified as clear of unexploded ordnance. This isn't a bureaucratic formality, it's a matter of survival. In April 2024, a 500-kilogram American-made bomb from World War II was found during construction near Miwa Arena in Mainz. 3,500 residents were evacuated. In June 2024, 2 separate 250-kilogram bombs were found and detonated on the grounds of Tesla's new factory site in Grünheide. In November 2025, 21,000 people were evacuated in Nuremberg after a 450-kilogram device was found at a construction site. This is not unusual. This is Tuesday. In Belgium, the National Bomb Disposal Unit, DOVO, recovers between 150 and 200 tons of unexploded ordnance every year. In France, the Département du Déminage recovers approximately 900 tons annually in areas that were battlefields in World War I. More than 20 members of Belgium's bomb disposal unit have been killed since the unit was founded in 1919. Since 1946, approximately 630 French ordnance disposal workers have died handling unexploded munitions. These people are not dying in wars. They are dying cleaning up after them. In the Hürtgen specifically, the situation is uniquely complicated. The Germans used wooden and glass mines throughout the forest. These devices contain no metal components, or almost none, making them completely invisible to conventional metal detectors. Nobody knows exactly where they all are, and crucially, the maps that documented the minefields were largely lost, destroyed, or never properly completed in the chaos of the battle. In Wassenack and Schmidt today, you will still find signs telling you not to leave marked paths because some areas remain mined and the precise locations are unknown. You can be standing in a place that looks completely ordinary, a hillside, a meadow at the forest's edge, and have no way of knowing whether the ground beneath you contains a wooden-cased shoe mine that no detector can find. The science of aging death. Here's something deeply uncomfortable that most people don't know. The assumption about old bombs and shells is that they become safer. Over time, that rust and corrosion gradually neutralize the threat, that 80 years of being underground renders them harmless relics. That assumption is wrong. In fact, for a significant portion of the unexploded ordnance still buried in the Hürtgen and across Europe, the opposite is true. In 2024, researchers at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment published a study in the journal Royal Society Open Science that examined the explosive material extracted from aged World War II unexploded ordnance. What they found was alarming. Many bombs and shells from both world wars were filled with an explosive compound called amatol, a mixture of ammonium nitrate and TNT. Amatol was adopted during World War I when pure TNT supplies ran short. It was cheaper and easier to manufacture, and it remained in widespread use throughout World War II. Both Allied and German munitions used it extensively. What the researchers found was that amatol samples extracted from aged unexploded ordnance were significantly more sensitive to impact than the compound should be. In some cases, up to 4 times more sensitive than standard amatol was ever expected to be. The reason appears to be that amatol, being hygroscopic, absorbs moisture from the surrounding soil over time. As the bomb casings corrode and the ammonium nitrate within reacts with metals in the soil, complex sensitizing salts form inside the explosive. The result is a compound that may detonate from a much smaller disturbance than the original freshly manufactured explosive would have required. To translate that into plain terms, a bomb that was buried in the Hürtgen Forest in 1944 and required a significant impact to detonate might today be triggered by a much lighter disturbance, by a construction excavator grazing it, by the pressure of a boot, by the vibration of a vehicle driving nearby. The fuses present their own separate nightmare. Many Allied bombs were equipped with chemical long-delay fuses, a glass vial of acetone designed to slowly dissolve a celluloid disc holding back a spring-loaded striker. The intention was to create a delayed detonation. When the bombs landed in soft soil at an angle, the acetone sometimes failed to flow correctly, disabling the fuse before it triggered. But the acetone continued dissolving the disc anyway, year after year. 80 years of slow chemical action. Some of those fuses may now be on the absolute edge of triggering, needing only the slightest disturbance to complete the work the bomb failed to do in 1944. This is why, in 2010, 3 experienced bomb disposal technicians were killed while attempting to defuse a World War II bomb found in Göttingen, Germany. They had between them defused between 600 and 700 unexploded bombs over their careers. The device that killed them was a 500-kilogram bomb with exactly this type of chemical fuse, one that had been slowly working toward detonation for 65 years, and that finally completed its circuit while they were working on it. The bombs are not sleeping quietly. They are aging badly, and as the years pass, they become less predictable, not more. The missing. Still coming home. The unexploded ordnance isn't the only legacy the Hürtgen refuses to surrender. Every year, approximately 7 sets of human remains are discovered in the forests and fields of the Hürtgen region. Soldiers from both sides who went missing in the chaos of that 5-month battle and whose bodies were swallowed by the forest, buried by mud, or simply never found during the frantic post-war recovery operations. Around 2014, the U.S. Defense Department's Joint POW/MIA Accounting Command compiled a comprehensive list of approximately 200 American soldiers still missing from combat in or near the Hürtgen Forest. In 2016, the Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, formally launched the Hürtgen Forest Project, a dedicated effort to account for those missing men. The work is painstaking. Historians at DPAA mark last known positions from battle reports and personnel files. Field teams conduct geophysical surveys and archaeological excavations in areas where the historical and geographical evidence points toward possible remains. When remains are found, either by DPAA teams or by German clearance teams stumbling across them in their ongoing ordnance work, they are sent to a DPAA laboratory for anthropological analysis, dental comparison, and DNA testing. As of the time this script was written, approximately 58 soldiers have been accounted for through the Hürtgen Forest Project. That means roughly 140 American men who went into that forest in the autumn and winter of 1944 are still there, somewhere. Some of the identifications that have been made are extraordinary in their detail. In December 2022, the remains of Army Sergeant John Radanovich, 23 years old, reported missing in action December 1, 1944, near the village of Großau, were positively identified through DNA analysis. The remains had been recovered from a field in 1946, buried in an American military cemetery in Belgium as an unknown soldier, and sat there for 75 years before modern DNA technology made identification possible. His family finally got an answer. In 2023, Army Private First Class George Thomas, 31 years old, reported missing in the Hürtgen in November 1944, was identified and returned to his family in Rhode Island. He was buried with full military honors nearly 80 years after he disappeared into that dark forest. These are not merely historical footnotes. These are real men with families. Children they left behind who grew up without them, who are now grandparents and great-grandparents themselves, who waited decades for news. The Hürtgen Forest is still in the process of giving them back, one name at a time. The Forgotten Battle. Here is something that almost no one in the United States knows. More Americans died in the Hürtgen Forest than on the island of Iwo Jima. More Americans died there than on Guadalcanal. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest consumed at minimum 33,000 American casualties over 5 months, the longest battle in United States Army history, fought on German soil, producing one of the highest casualty rates of the entire war for essentially no meaningful strategic gain. And almost nobody has heard of it. The battle was eclipsed almost immediately by the dramatic events on either side of it. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden, the bold Allied airborne assault in Holland, dominated headlines. In December, the Battle of the Bulge began with its dramatic German breakthrough and its iconic image of the 101st Airborne surrounded at Bastogne. The Hürtgen Forest ground on between those two defining stories, grinding up men in the dark trees, generating no dramatic victories or heroic photographs, producing only a slow and terrible accumulation of casualties with no clear narrative shape. When the war ended and the official histories were written, the Hürtgen barely registered. The men who survived it came home and found that the battle they considered the worst experience of their lives was a footnote, something most Americans had never heard of and didn't ask about. General James Gavin, who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division and entered the Hürtgen in February 1945 after the Battle of the Bulge, was perhaps most direct in his assessment. The Hürtgen Forest was an unexplainable mistake of the American General Staff. Unexplainable, fruitless, forgotten, but not gone, not by any measure, because while the battle left the history books almost entirely, it remained fully present in the soil of that forest, in the iron and the steel and the explosive compounds buried beneath the trees, and in the remains of the men who fought there and were never found. The forest today. If you walk into the Hürtgen Forest today, the scars are everywhere. If you know what to look for, follow the Call Trail, the same steep, treacherous path the Americans tried to use as a supply route in November 1944. Look carefully and you'll see the rusted tracks of an abandoned American tank still half visible among the roots and undergrowth on the slope, slowly being absorbed by the forest after 80 years. Depressions in the ground mark old foxholes and shell craters, now soft with moss and filled with leaves, but unmistakable in their shape. The remnants of concrete west wall bunkers emerge from the tree line, their walls cracked and covered with decades of vegetation. Dragon's teeth, the concrete anti-tank obstacles of the Siegfried Line, still protrude from the ground. In some areas, like the tombstones of a buried army, inside the wood of many of the older trees, if you could look inside, you would find metal. Shrapnel fragments fired in 1944 have been grown around by the trees, encased inside living wood as the trunk expanded over decades, invisible now, locked there permanently. The forest has tried to swallow what the war left behind. It hasn't entirely succeeded. The villages of the region have rebuilt themselves. Wassenack, Schmidt, Hürtgen, they are real communities again, with families and schools and churches. The museum Hürtgenwald, 1944, in the small town of Kleinhau, opens on Sundays to visitors who want to understand what happened here. American and German veterans, those who remain, still walk the forest together every October in a shared remembrance, two former enemies walking the same ground, where they once tried to kill each other. But the warning signs are still there. If you want to build a house anywhere in the Hürtgen region, even today, even in 2025 and beyond, the first call you make is to a bomb disposal team, not the second call or a precaution. The first call. Before a single foundation is dug, the ground must be surveyed and cleared, because the odds are not trivial. The ordnance is still there, under the fields at the forest's edge, in the gardens of homes, beneath the pastures where farmers keep their cattle, and some of it cannot be found. That's the uniquely terrifying truth about the Hürtgen. Other battlefields have their ordnance problems. France, Belgium, England all have their iron harvests. But the wooden and glass mines of the Hürtgen remain effectively invisible to any detection technology currently deployed. And there are no maps left showing where they all are. The men who laid them are long dead. All that can be done is to warn people away from certain areas and hope that nobody wanders where the signs tell them not to go. Every few years, buried mines occasionally detonate as tree roots grow around them and disturb their pressure plates. No human involved, just the slow, indifferent work of nature, pushing roots deeper into the earth and pressing down on things that have been waiting decades for exactly that kind of pressure. The forest is still finding ways to complete the work of 1944. Closing. There is a temptation when we talk about World War II to think of it as a closed chapter, something that happened in black and white in another century to people in old photographs wearing old uniforms. A war that ended with surrender ceremonies and celebration, and a clear line between then and now. The Hürtgen Forest tells a different story. It tells you that the line between then and now is not always clear, that some wars don't end when the generals sign their names, that landscapes hold on to the things we bury in them far longer than human memory does. The forest absorbed the ordnance of a war and hasn't finished giving it back. The soil absorbed the remains of men and is still returning them. The trees grew around the fragments of weapons and carry them still, locked inside their wood, as invisibly present as if they had been placed there yesterday. Approximately 72,000 Americans are still unaccounted for from World War II across all theaters of the conflict. Roughly 200 of them are somewhere in or near the Hürtgen Forest, in that 50-square-mile stretch of dark trees in western Germany that most Americans have never heard of. The DPAA's Hürtgen Forest project will keep searching. Teams will keep going in, carefully following the designated paths, using every tool available to find what the forest has been holding. Experts in bomb disposal have no timeline for when the ordnance problem will fully resolve. When asked, one senior German bomb disposal officer said simply, "There will still be bombs 200 years from now." 200 years from now. Long after everyone alive today is gone, that soil will still contain the residue of 5 months of slaughter in the autumn and winter of 1944. The war that most people have forgotten. The forest that hasn't. When people talk about the wounds of war, they usually mean emotional wounds, trauma, grief, loss, the kind of damage that travels through generations in the form of memory and silence and things never spoken. And all of that is real. All of that is true. But the Hürtgen Forest is a reminder that sometimes the wounds are also literal, that a 130 square kilometer patch of German woodland is itself wounded, its soil poisoned, its ground still armed, its trees still growing around the evidence of what was done there. The guns of the Hürtgen have been silent for 80 years. But the battle isn't over. Not for the soldiers whose names still appear on the walls of the missing. Not for the bomb disposal teams who answer the calls when something is found. Not for the families still waiting. And not for the forest itself, which continues, slowly and silently, to return what it was given. If this story stayed with you, and I hope it did, please consider subscribing to WW2 Tales. Every video on this channel is built the same way. Careful research, the real numbers, the real human stories treated with the respect they deserve. If you want to see more, there's a whole library of World War II history waiting for you here. Hit that like button, leave a comment with what surprised you most, and I'll see you in the next one. Because these stories deserve to be told.